Welcome back, everybody, to the deep dive. Today, we are diving deep into the book of Genesis. We've got a ton of your source material, maps, excerpts, even genealogies. It's going to be a wild ride.
Buckle up. It looks like we're going all the way back to the beginning.
Yeah, let's start with the title, Genesis. It's pretty straightforward, but I have a feeling there's a lot more to it than meets the eye.
Absolutely. I mean, every language that's translated Genesis,
Hmm.
it kind of reveals its core message in its own way. The Hebrew title, Bereshith, literally means in the beginning, while the Greek, Genetios, means origins. And even the Latin, Liber Genetios, emphasizes origins.
Okay, so we've got in the beginning and origin. So no matter how you slice it, the title is really pointing us to the idea of beginnings, right?
Exactly. It's all about where it all starts, like laying the foundation for this whole biblical narrative.
Okay, so we've got the foundation, but who was the architect? Tradition says Moses, but I know there are other theories floating around out there.
You're right. The traditional view is that Moses penned Genesis. But there's this other theory that's pretty intriguing. It's called the documentary hypothesis, and it suggests that there were actually multiple authors involved in writing Genesis, and maybe even the first 5 books of the Bible.
Multiple authors, huh? So instead of just Moses sitting down with a chisel and a stone tablet, we have a team of writers.
Well, not necessarily a team, more like, Matt, like a puzzle, And you have scholars who are looking at the text and they're kind of piecing together these different writing styles, different theological perspectives, and they're saying that maybe, different authors, each with their own, focus and style, contributed to Genesis over time.
I see. So it's like a literary tapestry woven from different threads.
Exactly.
So how does that change how we read and understand Genesis?
Well, it's a great question. The documentary hypothesis really challenges the traditional view of biblical authorship. So it does raise those questions about, how do we understand inspiration and revelation in light of this? It's something scholars have been debating for centuries.
Yeah, it's a big one. So what evidence do these scholars have for this multiple author idea?
Well, they look at things like, variations in the writing style, different names used for God throughout the text. They also point to what they see as editorial insertions, things that, like the list of kings in Genesis Thumb 6.31.
So instead of one seamless narrative, they're seeing these different pieces kind of stitched together.
Yeah, exactly. And the proponents of this theory say that these variations, they point to different authors, different perspectives, and they were writing at different times.
But if Moses didn't write it all, how can we be sure it's a reliable account of history and God's revelation?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question. The documentary hypothesis doesn't necessarily say there was no divine inspiration, but it does make you think, how did that inspiration work? Did it work through multiple people? It's not just an either-or, but a question of how these voices could have come together, possibly under God's guidance.
Right. And there are counter-arguments to consider too, right?
Absolutely.
Right.
Some scholars point to passages like Numbers 33.1 to 2, where it does seem like Moses is documenting the Israelites' journey.
Right, and others argue that Genesis actually has a pretty consistent literary style and a cohesive narrative, which would imply a single author.
Yeah, and you can't forget that detailed knowledge of Egyptian geography displayed in Genesis, like in chapter 13, verse 10. It kind of makes you think the author was pretty familiar with the region.
And there's Acts chapter 7, verse 22, where it says that Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians. That could contribute to that knowledge of geography too, right?
Absolutely. So you see, it's like evidence on both sides. And which perspective resonates more? That's a fascinating question, especially as we dive deeper.
It is. It reminds me that studying the Bible, it isn't about memorizing facts. It's about asking questions, sometimes tough questions, and wrestling with them. And maybe even exploring different perspectives.
Exactly. It's about the journey. And that brings us to another question. When was this book written?
Yeah, if we're not even sure who wrote it, how could we possibly know when it was written? Feels like we're trying to solve the historical mystery here.
Well, there are clues hidden within the Bible itself that might give us a timeline. Let's think about Moses for a second. I mean, his life was incredible. Maybe his life experiences can give us a bit of insight into when he might have written Genesis.
Yeah, okay, his life, pretty remarkable. What do we know about when he lived?
Well, we could look at it in 3 phases. His first 40 years were all about Egyptian culture and education. I mean, can you imagine the impact that must have had on his worldview?
Wow, 40 years. That's a significant chunk of time to be immersed in a culture so different from, well, from the Israelite culture he would later lead.
And then you've got another 40 years, this time shepherding in Midian. That's got to be a lot of time for, reflection, maybe even divine inspiration.
Right. Solitude, quiet, and a lot of sheep. Sounds like a pretty good recipe for contemplation. And when did the whole Exodus thing happen?
That would be from 1446 to 1406 BC. We see Moses in his full-on leadership role, leading the Exodus, receiving the law at Mount Sinai. It's very likely that he wrote the Pentateuch during this time, which includes Genesis.
Right. It makes sense. He's got all this experience, this Egyptian education, then his time in Midian, and now he's leading this huge Exodus, receiving the law. It's like all that comes together, and he's compiling these stories, these teachings.
Exactly. And if we use the biblical timeline, we might be able to figure out a possible time frame for Genesis. So we know Solomon reigned from 971 to 931 BC.
And 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1 tells us that Solomon began building the temple in 966 BC, 480 years after the Exodus. Okay, so doing the math, that places the Exodus in 1446 BC.
Right. Now we have to add the 430 years the Israelites lived in Egypt before the Exodus. That's in Exodus chapter 12, verse 40. And that gets us to 1876 BC, which would be the year that Jacob and his family moved to Egypt.
Okay, so we're working our way back. We've got Jacob's migration to Egypt in 1876 BC. Now, how do we get to the actual date of creation?
Well, if we use those dates and combine them with those genealogies detailed in Genesis chapters 5 and 11, we're looking at an estimated date of around 4000 BC for the creation of the earth.
4000 BC. Okay, so that suggests a relatively young Earth, right?
Yeah, that's one way to interpret the data, a perspective held by many who believe in a literal interpretation of Genesis.
But what about those who believe the Earth is much, much older? How do they reconcile their beliefs with the Genesis account?
That's another great question, and it's one that has sparked countless debates and discussions. Some people view those genealogies in Genesis, not literally, but symbolically, representing a kind of spiritual lineage rather than an exact step-by-step chronology.
So instead of reading Genesis as a science textbook, they're seeing it as a theological narrative, right? A story that reveals God's creative power and humanity's place in all of this.
Exactly. It's about the bigger picture. And regardless of how someone interprets that timeline, Genesis still provides this amazing framework for understanding human history. It's about seeing our history through the lens of God's creative and redemptive purposes. A story that speaks to our origins, our purpose, and our ultimate destiny.
Okay, I love a good story, and Genesis is packed with them. But it's not just a random collection of stories thrown together, is it? I mean, there has to be a structure, a framework that ties it all together.
You're right. Genesis is very carefully structured. One of the key things to look at is the idea of Toledeth. It's a Hebrew word meaning generations. Think of it like chapters in a book, only instead of chapters, we have these Toledeth.
So these Toledeth, they act as these signposts to guide us through the book.
Right, exactly. Each Toledeth, it introduces a new lineage, a new narrative. It highlights these key figures in that family line, and it pushes the story forward.
And these Toledeth, they actually help us see the two major parts of Genesis, don't they?
Absolutely. The first part, which is chapters 1 through 11, that's all about the beginning of the human race. It covers, those big monumental events, creation, the fall of humanity, the flood, and the scattering of the nations at Babel.
Right, so it's setting the stage for everything that comes after. And then the second part, chapters 12 through 50, that's where we zoom in on the beginning of the Hebrew race. It's all about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph.
Precisely. We're focusing on a particular family line here, tracing the ancestry of the Israelites and, uncovering God's plan for their future.
It's interesting how the book feels like a family history. This journey with these patriarchs, these, larger-than-life figures. It's like we're walking with them through ancient Mesopotamia, Canaan, Egypt.
And if you look at it on a map, it really brings it to life.
Yeah.
You can trace Abraham's journey from Ur to Canaan, Jacob's migration down to Egypt, and even Joseph's. His story is amazing. Just his journey as a slave. It's remarkable.
It really is. And it's a reminder, isn't it, that our choices, they don't just affect us. I mean, they ripple out. They have an impact on others, on generations to come. Just like those patriarchs in Genesis, their choices, their faith, their struggles, they shape the course of history. And in a way, they still shape us today.
It really is. It makes you realize, doesn't it, that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves. Like our lives are woven into this tapestry of history, just like those patriarchs back then.
It's humbling, isn't it? And speaking of humbling, let's talk about those themes. I mean, Genesis kicks off with that powerful statement, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." It's a declaration that is echoed through Well, through millennia, hasn't it? It's a reminder that God is in control. He's sovereign.
And it all started with just a word. God spoke, and it was. Creation unfolded through the power of his word.
Mind-blowing, right? The vastness of the cosmos, the intricate details of nature, all of it stemming from God's creative imagination.
And we're a part of that. We're made in God's image. Imagine that, made in the image of the Creator.
Yep.
That's an incredible privilege, but also a huge responsibility.
Absolutely. I mean, we have inherent value and dignity because of that, no matter what our circumstances are, no matter what we achieve or don't achieve. But it also means we have this unique capacity for a relationship with God, something that sets us apart from the rest of creation.
Exactly. We were designed for fellowship with him, to walk with him, to enjoy his presence like in the Garden of Eden.
And then comes the fall. Adam and Eve disobey. They choose to go their own way, and boom, everything changes. Sin enters the picture. That perfect relationship is fractured, and with it comes pain, suffering, death.
It's a tragic turning point, no doubt. But it's a story that resonates with all of us, doesn't it? I mean, we all know that temptation to choose our own way over God's way, and we've all experienced the consequences of those choices.
Yeah, it's like that story is written into our very being. We inherit this legacy of rebellion, and you see it play out throughout history, from Cain and Abel to, well, to the wickedness that leads to the flood.
The flood it's a powerful image, isn't it? The destructive power of sin, the consequences of rejecting God. But it's also a story of God's grace. Even judgment, he provides a way of escape.
He preserves Noah and his family, offering humanity a fresh start. It's a picture of God's mercy. He doesn't give up on us, even when we mess up royally.
Exactly. And that theme of faithfulness, God's faithfulness in the face of human failure, that continues throughout Genesis. We see with Abraham, the father of faith.
Abraham, the guy who was willing to leave everything behind and follow God's call, even though he didn't know where he was going.
Yeah. And even though he had doubts, he made mistakes, God remained faithful to that covenant he made with Abraham. He promised to make him into a great nation, to bless all the families of the earth through him.
It's a promise that reverberates through generations, from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob, and eventually to the 12 tribes of Israel.
And through that lineage, through the people of Israel, ultimately, the ultimate blessing would come, Jesus Christ.
Wow, so Genesis, it's not just ancient history, it's the beginning of a much bigger story. The story of redemption that finds its climax in Christ.
That's right. And it's a story that continues to unfold, doesn't it? I mean, we're all part of this grand narrative. Our choices, they matter. They shape our lives, the lives of those around us, maybe even generations to come.
It's powerful stuff. We're not just living for ourselves. We're part of this much bigger picture. And Genesis provides that framework, doesn't it? It helps us see how our lives fit into God's plan.
It's a journey of discovery, intellectually stimulating, and I think spiritually enriching too.
And speaking of journeys, we can't talk about Genesis without talking about those characters. Those aren't just names on a page, are they? They were real people who faced real challenges. They wrestled with faith and doubt, temptation, loss, just like we do today.
That's what makes them so relatable, I think. Their stories, they become like these mirrors, reflecting our own struggles and our own victories.
You know, one character who always stands out to me is Joseph. Talk about a life full of drama and betrayal and forgiveness, and ultimately redemption.
Joseph's story, it's a classic. It's a masterpiece of storytelling. All those twists and turns, you're on the edge of your seat. But it's also this profound reflection on the nature of God, on his plan for humanity.
What fascinates me is how Joseph, he becomes this foreshadowing of Jesus. He becomes a type of Christ.
The parallels are amazing. I mean, both Joseph and Jesus, beloved sons, chosen by their fathers for a special purpose, both betrayed by their own brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, unjustly imprisoned.
It's unbelievable. And yet both of them emerge from that suffering, not with bitterness, but with this power to bring about salvation and reconciliation.
Exactly. Joseph, he rises to power in Egypt. What does he do? He saves his family. He saves a nation from famine. And Jesus, through his death and resurrection, he conquers sin and death. He offers salvation to all who believe.
It's like their stories are two sides of the same coin, reflecting those themes of betrayal, of suffering, and ultimately of victory. And through Joseph's story, we get this glimpse of that even greater story of redemption that God is weaving throughout history.
It's a beautiful illustration of how God can take even the most difficult situations, the most painful experiences, and use them for good, to accomplish his purposes, to reveal his glory.
And that's a message that, well, that gives me hope. It reminds me that even when things seem dark, even hopeless, God is still working behind the scenes. He's still orchestrating his plan. He's bringing beauty from ashes.
And just like Joseph, who forgave his brothers, offered them reconciliation, a new beginning, Jesus offers that same forgiveness, that new life, to everyone who turns to him.
It's a message of hope that transcends time, transcends circumstances. It speaks to the deepest longings of the human heart.
It reminds us that we're not defined by our past mistakes, by our current struggles. In Christ, we have the promise of a future filled with hope and redemption.
And that promise, that hope, it's rooted in the very beginning. It's rooted in Genesis. It's the foundation of our faith. It's the starting point for our journey with God.
Genesis, it's like this seed that's planted in our hearts. And within that seed is this potential for growth, for transformation, for a life that's aligned with God's purposes.
And when we explore Genesis, we're not just, digging up historical facts or theological concepts. We're encountering the living God. He speaks to us through these stories. He invites us into a relationship with him.
And that relationship, that's the greatest adventure of all.
It's amazing how these stories from so long ago, they still have the power to change our lives today. We've talked about a lot, the people, the timeline, even those debates about who actually wrote it. But what's the thread that connects it all? What's the big takeaway from Genesis?
Well, I think at its heart, Genesis lays out this grand narrative of the whole Bible, really.
Yeah.
Creation, the fall, and the redemption. It's like the bedrock, the foundation for the entire biblical story.
So it's more than just history or a bunch of moral lessons. It's like a blueprint, a roadmap for understanding God's plan for humanity, for us.
Exactly. Genesis, it introduces these themes that echo throughout the entire Bible. I mean, you see creation mirrored in those descriptions of the new heavens and the new earth in Revelation, right? And then the fall, it's reflected in that ongoing struggle with sin and its consequences that we see in every generation, right? And finally, redemption. Redemption finds its ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ.
It's like a symphony, right? Genesis is like the first movement, introducing those themes that are going to be woven throughout the whole composition.
That's a great analogy. And just like you wouldn't have a symphony without that first movement, you wouldn't have the Bible, the rest of the Bible, without Genesis. It sets the stage, introduces the characters, and really sets up that conflict that drives the whole narrative forward.
So even when we're reading other books in the Bible, we can always go back to Genesis, right? For context, for deeper understanding. It's like having this master key that unlocks the deeper meaning of the whole thing.
Yeah, precisely. And by grasping that narrative, we can start to understand ourselves better, our place in the world, and ultimately our relationship with God.
Something that really stood out to me as we were going through Genesis is how it establishes Israel as God's chosen people. It's a concept that's had such a huge impact on history. But what does that mean for us today?
That's a big question, a really important one. And it's important to remember that God's choice of Israel wasn't arbitrary. He had a purpose, He chose them to be a blessing to all nations. Through them, he would reveal his character, his laws, and ultimately his plan of salvation for everyone.
So it wasn't about playing favorites or being exclusive. It was about God working through a specific group of people to accomplish his plan for all humanity.
Exactly. And that's something you see throughout the Old Testament. God's covenant with Abraham, with his descendants. It's ultimately about extending his grace and mercy to the whole world. It foreshadows the gospel, the good news, that salvation is open to everyone. It doesn't matter your background, your ethnicity. It's for everyone.
And speaking of the gospel, we've touched on how Christ is foreshadowed in Genesis through typology. Seeing those connections is fascinating, but I'm curious, why? Why is that important? Why should we care about these foreshadowings?
Well, typology, it's like it helps us understand how the Old Testament, how it points forward to Christ. It's like, imagine you're reading a mystery novel and you start picking up on those clues, those hints that point to the solution. That's what typology is like.
So it's not just about finding cool parallels, but about seeing how they can actually, deepen our understanding of who Jesus is, what he did.
Exactly. A great example is Adam. Adam is often seen as a type of Christ. They're both representative figures. Adam, he's the head of humanity. Christ is the head of the new creation. Adam's sin, it brought death to all. But Christ's sacrifice, it brings life to all who believe.
And then you have the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? Where Abraham's willing to sacrifice his son. It's such a powerful picture, a foreshadowing of God's own sacrifice, his own son, Jesus, on the cross.
Yeah. In Genesis 22:5, Abraham tells his servants that he and Isaac will go worship and come back to you. And when you look at it in light of Christ's resurrection, it takes on a whole new meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Even in the midst of that sacrifice, that loss, God's still working. He's bringing about his plan. He's ultimately bringing life out of death.
And you see that theme throughout Genesis, the flood, the exile. There's always that glimmer of hope, that promise of restoration. It's a reminder that God is faithful. He keeps his promises.
And that's a message we need today, In a world full of brokenness, suffering, Genesis reminds us that God is still in control. He's still working, still offering hope and redemption. Redemption to anyone who turns to him.
It's a message that can help us through those tough times. Even in the chaos, the uncertainty, God's with us. He's guiding us, leading us toward a future filled with hope and glory.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today,
Yeah.
a lot. But we've only just scratched the surface of what Genesis has to offer. This is a book that deserves, to be read and reread, studied. There's always something new to discover, a deeper truth to uncover.
That's the beauty of the Bible. It's alive, It speaks to us in different ways at different times in our lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis, is there one thing you'd like to leave our listeners with, the most important takeaway from all of this?
Yeah, here's something to think about. As you keep exploring the Bible, remember that Genesis, it's not just an ancient text. It's a living story that speaks to the deepest parts of us, to those longings of the human heart. It's that story of creation, fall, and redemption. A story that finds its climax, its fulfillment in Christ. It offers hope. It offers transformation to everyone who embraces it.
That's a great way to put it. Genesis, it's an invitation to, to discover where we fit into God's story, to remember that we're not just random individuals out there, but part of something so much bigger, something that gives our lives purpose, meaning. And with that, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the book of Genesis. We'll see you next time.